Hi, I'm Tobin, and I like to watch films about nuns. Now, don't get the wrong idea, it's purely an intellectual interest. I've been meaning to watch this movie, The Nun, for a long time. It's one of the bigger nun films out there, so it's been a long time coming. The Nun is from 1966. It was directed by Jacques Rivette. I also have a video about his film, Celine and Julie Go Boating, on this channel. The Nun is one of the most impressive films of the 1960s, I think, but you probably won't hear about it in the discussion of the New Wave, and it isn't as widely seen as I had imagined up here. The Nun is a complicated movie, but we can ease our way into it with some simple things. First of all, this film is episodic. It's about a woman named Suzanne, played by Anna Karina. You'll never believe this, but she becomes a nun, and we follow her time with three different mother superiors. These three different mothers demarcate different chapters in the film. Suzanne's own mother is here too, although I'm not sure what you should conclude about motherhood from this film. I'll come back to that. This movie is 2 hours and 20 minutes long, almost as long as this video. I'm not really sure if having these relatively separate episodes or chapters makes the film feel shorter or longer. It does probably help the film to be more dynamic, but on the other hand, some of the plots don't feel like they've reached their climax. Maybe they could be taken a little bit further if the entire film was dedicated just to one of these parts. On the other hand, jarring changes are often a part of life, and this movie captures them in an incisive way. When we start to think about how this movie maybe incorporates ideas of fate, Jansenist ideas of fate, maybe the big changes that Suzanne faces are actually important. This movie was based on a book from 1796, I haven't read it, an anti-clerical book that made quite a stir. In general, this movie has a negative view of convent life. I'll talk more about this later. It was hard for Rivette to get this movie made, and not everybody liked it when it came out. The Nun is also based on a play. In fact, Rivette directed the play first. I think Anna Karina was in the play too. I didn't know this when I was watching the movie, didn't know about the play, but it was clear that there was some kind of theatrical influence. There's a lot of the drama in this movie kind of comes from talking, just people talking to each other. I guess that sort of describes most movies, but I think you'll know what I mean if you watch it. Maybe we've already had a few hints about why this movie may or may not be thought of as part of the New Wave, this kind of theatrical, historical thing. I'm not going to take sides on that just yet. The style of the film is complex. It has a lot of different influences, I think. First things first, this is a Rivette film, and as expected, it looks really cool. There is sort of an austere feeling to the film, a stiff feeling at times. Partly this comes from the barren settings inside the convent, and there's a coldness to a number of the characters, a stiffness. Lots of cool tones in the film, lots of natural light in the movie, a beautifully lit film. Not a lot of close-ups in this movie. This film feels kind of old, historical, almost conservative in a ways, but at the same time, it has some obvious modern influences. Maybe the most clear thing here is the score, which is largely atonal. The atonal score was all the rage in the 1960s. Think about The Planet of the Apes, or even some of the incidental music in Mission Impossible. This film has some really slick edits in it, often paired with a strange sound effect. So some clear modernist stylistic influence. This film is kind of a measured historical film, like I said, but it also has some scandal in it and sort of about it as well. This is a somewhat salacious movie. It's larger than life at times. Suzanne really suffers in this film, and you see her sometimes white-faced with her hair down, looking ghostly. It almost looks like something out of a movie like Qui-Gon, very expressionistic. There are hints of exploitation in this film. Of course, there's a whole genre of nunsploitation where nuns are subjected to their antitheses, right, to the occult and to horror stuff, right? That isn't really what's going on in this movie, but there are some elements of horror in this film. There's a great scene where Suzanne is being sort of tormented by some of the other sisters. She goes to her cell, and you see one of the other nuns just peering around the door. It looks like something out of a classic horror film. Sexualization is also, in some ways, at the core of the film. It's hard to unpack exactly how this functions, but it's in a way that reminds you, oh yeah, this came out in 1966. So sort of this historical feeling movie, this stodgy, stiff historical film, but also a modern film in some ways. At the same time, the word melodrama might also come to mind. Some people might flinch at that term. This movie is very curt and unsentimental at times. For instance, the ending. And I don't want to say, hey, it's a movie about a woman's plight, so it must be melodramatic. But there are hints of Hollywood here, and I would be curious to compare the film more rigorously with movies like Shock Corridor or maybe Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Those are both from the early 1960s. There's also the so-called women's films from the 1930s. Those come to mind, something like Stella, Dallas. These might seem like offensive comparisons, really, but I think it would be interesting to understand how these movies do the same thing and how they differ, especially when it comes to sort of the subjectivity of their leads. In some ways, it feels weird to compare The Nun to other movies because the product of all these different influences is a film that feels quite different from others. I think The Nun is a great movie for cinephiles because it's not like much else. A final note here is that The Nun begins with a really interesting framing device that exemplifies some of the factors that I was just talking about. First, the movie introduces the source material. It actually downplays the book in some ways, saying that it was written quickly, maybe don't read too much into it. Next, the movie actually downplays itself, saying, hey, remember, it's just a movie, don't take it too seriously. It's a bit more subtle than that. The prologue is interesting. Actually, the prologue is slightly confusing. You might think, I don't know enough about history to watch this movie. There's a few places in the film where you might think that. Don't worry about it. You can definitely understand maybe not every single nuance, but you can watch this film even if you have no idea what France is. None of the info in the prologue turned out to be particularly crucial. You might wonder why this prologue is there at all, actually. Without it, the movie would be kind of similar. It does provide some context here and there, but the mention of the source material, for instance, is not very significant. I don't think that's necessary. So why is it there at all? Maybe Rivette was just trying to appease the censors. That's possible. But I see this as a pretty significant moment of authorial imposition, a critical frame that links the film to some of the present-day patterns of thought that ultimately shape the movie fairly profoundly. It alludes to a certain kind of intellectual engagement. Authorial imposition really sounds like the New Wave, doesn't it? It's worth noting that many New Wave directors were working against the so-called tradition of quality, which included a lot of safe historical films with big sets, big scope, the epic movie, essentially. Maybe Rivette is trying to steer away from that kind of historicism by throwing in some random intellectualizing at the start. That's a bit too cynical. But yeah, he's perhaps demonstrating a certain type of intellectualism that he wants to be associated with a critical eye. Honestly, I could make this whole video just about the first 2 minutes of this movie. If you've seen the film, I'd be curious what you made exactly of this frame at the beginning. You might worry that this frame actually undermines the force of the movie in some ways, given that they say, hey, it isn't real, don't worry about it. In practice, though, I think the audience is going to forget about that. But still, is it destabilizing? In some ways, is it important to bring the book in? Does it set the stage for some of the critical thinking throughout the film that's much more undercover? This framing thing at the beginning is by far the most sort of explicit part of the movie. Anyway, it's interesting. I think you get the picture about the style and really the philosophy of the film. It's somewhat historical, but it's also kind of modernist. So is it a new wave film? Well, honestly, who cares? Most movies straddle different eras and genres. Rivette did write for the Cahiers du Cinéma. You might find The Nun similar to Vivre sa vie. I don't know how to speak French. Also with Anna Karenina. That's another movie, another story about a woman without very many options, right? So I think we're now stumbling into what this movie is about. At a high level, it's hard to say that this movie is anything other than a pretty harsh critique of convents and the church. I don't mean unfairly harsh. I just mean pretty biting critique of convents and the church. Rather than being spiritual haven, the convents in The Nun seem more like prisons that Suzanne is consigned to only because of some arbitrary lack of prospects. You can probably fill in the rest. Obviously, it's a fairly misogynistic system. To me, this movie seems more political than spiritual. In my favorite nun film, I think the balance is reversed, but I don't want to sound resentful here. There's a lot to this movie, and it all starts from a visceral contention that probably resonated in the 1960s and that still resonates, an idea that this system is rigged, is not great, let's put it that way. The overall moral arc of the movie might be somewhat clear, but there are a number of interesting detours that I think help the film not really feel that didactic. I'd be curious what you think of this. But to me, this didn't feel exactly like a moralistic movie. The film starts with Suzanne refusing her vows, somewhat dramatically, but she ends up changing her mind about this, sort of, not really. When she joins the convent, after all, she isn't exactly thrilled to be there, but it seems possible, maybe, that she might find a way into the life. Of course, her circumstances change dramatically under the different mother superiors. Each of these characters is quite complex. I don't want to spoil things, but I'll talk a little bit about the first one. The first Mother Superior actually seems genuinely compassionate for Suzanne. She prays for her. She is worried about her. It seems that she might feel so deeply for Suzanne that she endangers her own health. She might care too much about her. This sounds nice, but maybe you wonder if the mother is worried that Suzanne won't take her vows, or that she's worried that she will. The fact that Suzanne's first experience in the convent is compassionate keeps this from feeling like a morality play. Like I said, there's certain detours that keep things interesting in some ways. I was struck by a moment later on when the third Mother Superior asked Suzanne what she misses from the outside world, and Suzanne doesn't have a big list. She can only name one thing, which is freedom. Now, that's a pretty good reason to want to leave, but maybe you wonder what Suzanne's prospects outside the convent would be, what her view of the outside world really is. You can only name one thing that you're missing? She doesn't even know what she's missing, and maybe that's the ultimate tragedy. Or might the outside world be even more cruel? Okay, the point is that this movie doesn't seem too moralistic, and in a number of ways it tacks away from, I think, the prevailing moral wind. But don't worry, by the end, I think the message is somewhat clear. One of the things that is interesting about convents is that they seem kind of matriarchal. Of course, everyone living there is a woman, usually, and the convents are internally at least run by women. In large orders, this hierarchy extends beyond just one convent, and there can be a big global order. In some ways, this might seem kind of progressive. On the other hand, convents are the definition of conservatism. I think there is a level of indirection in this movie where it seems that the church is a misogynistic institution, but most of the nefarious acts that we see are carried out by women, by the nuns, in fact. Actually, most of the men that we meet in the movie are nice. They're quite reasonable, perhaps. Some of them seem wise. We even meet a priest, well, not a priest, but some religious guy, who feels that he has been forced to become a priest, because he had no vocation, just like Suzanne. At first, this might seem to undermine this moral arc that I was just talking about. Wait a second. The men are the nice ones, and it's the nuns doing the bullying? Hold on. I think what's really going on here is that the film is indicating that this system that's holding everyone down is not really about individuals. There's something more complex going on here, right? A big part of this movie is this question of how these institutions work. And this film shows pretty clearly that it's not just a question of one party oppressing another. Well, maybe at a high level it is, but when you actually look into things, the story is a lot more complicated. But how does this power work? Where does it come from, right? These are some questions that I think are kind of folded into this movie. This film came out around the time when Foucault was starting to write about some of these things. That's a pretty shaky comparison, but I think in general, you can see how this film might mirror some of the reevaluation of institutions that was happening in the 1960s. I talked about the beginning of the film already. One thing that is mentioned in the opening sort of framing is that convents at the time when the movie's set, often weren't as strictly governed as you might think. Women of status were often made Mother Superior, for instance, even if they were inexperienced. That doesn't sound like religious rigor. There were parties at the convents. You'll see some of this stuff borne out in the film. This incisive look at a sacred tradition, showing not what's supposed to happen, but what is really happening, is maybe another part of what defined this era of thinking in the 1960s. When it comes to how this system functions, the movie doesn't really spell things out, but there are some pretty provocative scenes that at the very least suggest that this is a strange way for the world to have worked. For example, at one point, Suzanne sues the church. What? She sues the church? I didn't really expect a nun to be able to do this. It kind of feels like the church and the law would be totally separate. You kind of think, wait a second, you could sue people back then? In fact, there is some process for taking the convent, the church, to court. Interesting. There's a great scene a bit later on where some council of church leaders are discussing Suzanne. And you know what? They seem diligent. They seem like they've done their research and like they're thoughtful. But what are they discussing? Whether or not she should be exorcised. That's interesting. Probably anything involving exorcism is going to seem a bit weird to us today. But it's interesting to see how banal these sort of proceedings were. Okay. Maybe the last thing to discuss is how shame and humiliation fit into all of this. There's a really interesting line towards the beginning of the movie where Suzanne's mother says that Suzanne is the only thing holding her back from heaven. This is quite the switcheroo because it seems pretty clear that Suzanne is the victim, yet her mother has somehow turned things around so that she's the one to be pitied. I think all three of the Mother Superiors go on to make a similar move. With the first one, it's more benign. Again, you might think, wait a second, isn't Christianity supposed to be about love? Well, for one reason or another, shame is an enormous part of this system, In some ways, shame is both the punishment and the crime. The punishment and the crime. Suzanne's mother, for instance, wants to distance herself away from her daughter's shame as though it is contagious, right? On the other hand, Suzanne is constantly punished with humiliation. Interesting. I was reminded of the film The White Ribbon, which I have a video on. Shame, I guess, in a time when religion was more dominant in culture, was an extremely powerful axis, right? Not so much in the United States today, at least. I think that's most of what I have to say about The Nun for now. I wish I had a little bit more time with this movie because there is a lot here. Think of this only as my gut reaction to the film, my preliminary thoughts. This is a cool movie. It's a cinephiles movie. Check it out. It's nice to watch. It is surprisingly deep. I'll say, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. On the surface, okay, a pretty visceral, a bit of a gut punch in terms of a story about a woman really deprived of choices. I think that's got to be kind of the headline of the film. But beneath the surface, a lot of depth when it comes to how these institutions actually exist. And like I said, not really a story of individuals. There's not. This film nicely dodges some easy answers. It doesn't show any of the Mother Superiors, even some of the ones who are more brutal, more harsh. It doesn't exactly seem like the system, it doesn't exactly seem like the problem stems just from the character flaws of one individual. Oh, the problem is just that you have a bad Mother Superior who happens to be really mean. Not so much. Like I said, it's another sort of interesting little twist that many of the men in the film seem actually quite reasonable, quite nice. Again, the film kind of dodges explanation for this thing. I think you have to keep looking up and up and up to figure out, where did things go wrong here? Why is the system so cruel? Look up. Maybe not all the way up to the big guy himself, but maybe just below that. Is it possible that the religious concept itself, the religious system itself, is crooked? I don't know. This is a pretty cynical movie. Like I said, my favorite nun films are a little bit more ambivalent and give a little bit more credence to spiritual, to the spiritual benefits of religion. It's hard to argue that this movie has anything positive to say about the church, but maybe I overlooked some of the more spiritual content. There's a couple moments where they talk more explicitly about theological subjects that I didn't understand very well, so it's possible there's something in there that I didn't pick up on. Anyway, like I said, I wish I had a bit more time to wrap my head around this, but at the very least, there's some thinking about The Nun. I'm hoping to do some more Rivette films on the channel, maybe the really long one at some point. If you have any recommendations, I guess they're all pretty long, but the really long one, you know what I'm talking about. If you have any recommendations for some of his work, let me know.